Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, the forest holds its breath. It has seen much, witnessed untold stories whispered between ancient trees, but few are as chilling, as stark, as the legend born in its very heart, where the line between predator and prey blurred, then shattered completely. This is the story of a hunt, yes, but not the one you imagine. This is the story of how the hunted became the hunter, and the woods kept their terrible secret. The legend of Elara does not begin with the hunt itself, but in the suffocating stillness of the plantation quarters just before the midnight hour. To understand her flight, one must first visualize the invisible weight of the chains she wore long before iron ever touched her ankles. For years she had been a shadow among shadows, observing the cruel mechanics of Master Abernathy's estate with a mind that refused to be broken. While the other exhausted souls slept the sleep of the defeated, Elara was awake, mapping the stars and memorizing the language of the wind. She knew that the path to freedom was not merely a physical distance, but a psychological threshold that few dared to cross. The catalyst for her departure was not a sudden burst of anger, but a cold, crystalline realization that the darkness of the woods was safer than the light of the master's porch. On that fateful night, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and wood smoke, a deceptive sweetness that masked the rot of the labor camps. Elara gathered no belongings, for she carried her tools within her, a sharp memory of the terrain, and a heart hardened into flint. She stepped over the threshold of her shack, her bare feet making no sound on the packed red clay of the Georgia earth. To leave was to commit a capital crime, an act of theft against a man who claimed to own her soul. As she reached the perimeter where the manicured fields met the jagged edge of the primal forest, she paused to look back one final time. The plantation house sat on the hill like a pale, watchful ghost, its tall white pillars standing as monuments to the blood spilled in the furrows below. There was no fear in her eyes, only a grim focus as she watched the distant flickering of a single lantern in the overseer's window. She knew the alarm would soon shatter the silence, and that Silas would relish the opportunity to track a human being through the muck. With a breath that felt like her first taste of true oxygen, she turned her back on the lash forever. The transition into the tree line was like stepping into another world, where the laws of men held no dominion and the ancient spirits reigned. The transition from the open fields to the dense thicket offered a terrifying protection, as the canopy swallowed the moonlight and draped her in velvet blackness. Behind her, the first faint baying of the hounds began to echo across the valley, a sound meant to paralyze the heart of any runaway. But Elara did not tremble. She allowed the sound to ground her, using the distant noise to judge the speed and distance of her inevitable pursuers. She was no longer a piece of property fleeing a master. She was a force of nature reclaiming its rightful place. By the time the sun began to gray the eastern horizon, Elara had already vanished deep into the bogs, where the water hides all scent. She had crossed the invisible line, where the hunted begins to study the habits of those who follow, noting the heavy-handed way men move through brush. Every step she took was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of chess, leading her enemies further away from the familiar and into the unknown. She knew they would come with guns and dogs, fueled by arrogance and the legal right to kill, yet she felt a strange, surging calm. In the silence of the deep woods, Elara waited, knowing that the hunt they started would be finished on her terms. When the sun rose over the Abernathy estate, the discovery of Elara's empty shack ignited a fury that moved swifter than the morning mist. Master Abernathy did not merely want his property returned. He demanded a spectacle of retribution to satisfy his wounded pride and maintain his iron grip. He summoned Silas, an overseer whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his uncanny ability to track those who fled into the wild. Silas was a man who viewed the hunt not as a duty, but as a sport that allowed him to exercise his darkest impulses. He spent the early hours cleaning his rifle with a slow, methodical precision that signaled a long and bloody day ahead. This was not a rescue mission, but a calculated display of power designed to extinguish any flickering embers of hope. To ensure the hunt was swift and decisive, Silas handpicked 4 men from the surrounding territory who shared his thirst for the chase. There was Miller, a local trapper who knew the taste of the swamp, and 3 brothers whose names were synonymous with the local night patrols. These men were not soldiers, but they were seasoned in the art of human capture, carrying with them the arrogance of those who have never been challenged. They arrived at the plantation gates with their saddles packed and their canteens filled, laughing as they joked about how quickly the girl would break. To them, Elara was not a person but a prize, a stray animal that had wandered too far from its designated pen. Their confidence was a thick, cloying shroud that blinded them to the reality of the terrain they were about to enter. The equipment they carried reflected a grim tradition of violence, ranging from heavy-gauge shotguns to coiled leather whips and rusted iron shackles. Silas insisted on bringing 2 massive bloodhounds, beasts with sagging jowls and eyes that burned with a primal, bred-in aggression for the scent of human skin. The clinking of chains and the sharp metallic click of cocking hammers provided a rhythmic soundtrack to their final preparations under the blistering morning sun. They checked their maps, though they looked at them with a dismissive eye, believing that no woman could survive long in the deep brush. Every tool they packed was intended to inflict pain or ensure a humiliating return, leaving no room for the possibility of failure. Their preparations were a testament to a system that relied on overwhelming force to keep the spirit of liberty at bay. Before they departed, Master Abernathy stood on his porch, a shadow behind the white pillars, offering a bounty that turned the hunt into a race. He promised gold and extra rations to the man who first laid hands on her, further stoking the greed of the already eager party. Silas tipped his hat, a gesture of cold professional respect, before signaling the men to mount their horses and head toward the darkening tree line. The dust kicked up by their hooves hung in the stagnant air long after they had vanished from the sight of the other laborers. As they rode, the atmosphere shifted from the structured order of the plantation to the chaotic, lawless beauty of the Georgia wilderness. They moved with the loud, heavy thrum of men who believe they are the apex predators in every environment they inhabit. As the 5 men approached the edge of the woods, the dogs began a low, vibrating growl that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of their bones. Silas looked at the tangled vines and the ancient, moss-covered oaks with a smirk, believing the forest would eventually surrender his prey to him. He did not notice how the birds fell silent as they crossed the threshold, or how the shadows seemed to stretch and twist to meet them. The party rode in a tight formation, their boots clicking against stirrups, oblivious to the fact that they were leaving the world where their names carried weight. They entered the green cathedral of the swamp with their heads held high and their weapons ready, hunting a woman they completely undervalued. Little did they know that the very air was thickening around them, marking the beginning of a journey from which none would return. The deeper the 5 men rode into the ancient timberland, the more the world of the plantation felt like a fading, sun-bleached memory. The horses began to lather at the neck, their ears twitching at the unfamiliar groans of cypress trees swaying in the hidden currents of air. Silas led the way, his eyes fixed on the muddy earth, searching for a broken branch or a shallow footprint in the muck. But the forest floor was a chaotic tapestry of rotting leaves and deceptive roots that seemed to shift under the weight of their gaze. The heat became a physical presence, a wet blanket that muffled their voices and turned their confident shouts into strained, hollow whispers. They were no longer riding through a backyard, but through a cathedral of shadows that refused to offer up its secrets. As the afternoon light filtered through the canopy, it turned a sickly, bruised purple, casting long and distorted shapes across their path. The hounds, once eager and baying with a terrifying hunger, now kept their tails tucked low, their whimpers echoing the rising unease of the men. Miller, the trapper, pointed out that the tracks they were following seemed to lead in impossible circles, weaving through the densest thorns. It was as if the prey were mocking them, dancing through the briars while they struggled with heavy boots and snagging equipment. The air grew thick with the hum of insects, a relentless drone that grated on their nerves and made the grip on their rifles slippery. Every time they stopped to listen, the silence of the woods felt heavier, more deliberate, and infinitely more hostile. By the time they reached the edge of the great bog, the bravado that had fueled their departure had begun to curdle into a cold, sharp anxiety. The ground beneath the horses' hooves turned into a treacherous slurry of black peat and stagnant water, threatening to swallow them whole. Silas cursed the darkness, refusing to admit that the woman they hunted was moving with a grace and speed they could not replicate. They were forced to dismount, their polished boots sinking deep into the filth, stripping away the last vestiges of their perceived southern authority. The trees here were draped in long, grey beards of Spanish moss that brushed against their faces like the cold fingers of the dead. In this labyrinth of water and wood, the hunters realized they were losing their sense of direction and their sense of self. Every snap of a dry twig in the distance now sent a jolt of adrenaline through the group, causing them to level their guns at shadows. They began to bicker amongst themselves, their voices sharp with a growing realization that the forest was not their ally in this grim endeavor. The 3 brothers stayed close together, their eyes darting toward the thickets, where the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. They were seasoned men, but they were used to hunting in the open where the sun provided a clear view of their targets. Here, the landscape was a blur of emerald and obsidian, a place where a person could be standing 5 feet away and remain invisible. The realization that they were being watched, rather than just doing the watching, began to settle over them like a fever. As nightfall finally claimed the woods, the 5 men found themselves huddled around a meager, flickering flame that did little to push back the dark. The circle of light only served to highlight the vastness of the wilderness pressing in on them from every single side. Silas sat with his rifle across his knees, staring into the blackness with a grimace that masked a creeping, unfamiliar sensation of dread. They could hear the distant cry of a panther or a loon, sounds that mimicked human screams and kept their hearts hammering. They believed they were waiting for morning to resume the hunt, but the forest had already closed its gates behind them. Somewhere in the dark, Elara was not running anymore. She was positioned in the shadows, waiting for the fire to die. The shift began not with a scream, but with the sudden, suffocating absence of the hound's frantic and bloodthirsty barking. Silas called out into the blackness, his voice cracking as he realized the lead dog's chain now hung limp and silent. One by one, the hunters felt the predatory gaze of the woods turning inward, stripping away their arrogance like dead skin. The fire they huddled around flickered and died as if choked by an invisible hand, leaving them in a void. Elara was no longer fleeing. She had merged with the darkness, becoming the very shadow that haunted their frantic, darting eyes. They were 5 armed men, yet they felt smaller than the smallest insect crawling beneath the damp and rotting leaves. Panic took root when the first of the brothers vanished into the brush without making a single sound of struggle. The remaining men fired blindly into the trees, the muzzle flashes illuminating nothing but the cold and indifferent Spanish moss. Every time they stopped to reload, they could hear a soft, melodic humming that seemed to drift from the canopy above. It was a funeral dirge sung in a voice that held no fear, only the weight of 1,000 years of justice. They realized too late that their weapons were useless against a ghost who knew every bog and every pitfall. The swamp water rose to meet them, dragging at their heels as they stumbled deeper into the woman's intricate trap. Miller, the seasoned trapper, was the next to fall as he stepped into a sinkhole Elara had carefully concealed. His muffled cries were ignored by his companions, who were now consumed by the primal urge to simply survive the night. Silas tried to rally them, but his authority had dissolved into the mist. Leaving him a hollow man in a hollow world, he saw a flash of white fabric between the cypress knees and gave chase, only to find himself standing alone. The forest seemed to rearrange itself behind him, cutting off his path back to the horses and the safety of the trail. He was the master of the lash, but here, in the heart of the wild, he was merely a trespasser. The psychological torture was more effective than any physical blow, as Elara played upon their deepest and most superstitious fears. She used the environment as a weapon, mimicking the sounds of their names until they turned upon one another in a frenzy. The 2 remaining brothers, blinded by terror, mistook each other for the phantom of the woods and drew their knives. By the time the steel found its mark, the realization of their mistake was the last thing they ever truly knew. Elara watched from the high branches, her eyes reflecting the cold light of a moon that favored the oppressed. She was the architect of their ruin, a silent witness to the collapse of a power built on nothing but cruelty. By the hour of the wolf, only Silas remained, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps that tore at his lungs. He stumbled into a small clearing where Elara stood waiting, bathed in a silver light that made her look divine. There was no hatred in her expression, only a terrifyingly calm resolve that froze the blood in his very veins. He tried to raise his rifle, but his hands refused to obey, trembling under the weight of his mounting and overdue sins. As she stepped forward, the trees seemed to lean in to watch the final act of this inverted and bloody hunt. The woods had claimed the others, but Silas belonged to her, and she would make sure his end was memorable. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the heavy canopy, the forest was filled with a terrifying, unnatural stillness. No horses returned to the Abernathy plantation, and no triumphant shouts broke the silence of the long, winding road leading back. The search parties sent out weeks later found only the remnants of a campsite reclaimed by the fast, moving vines. They found rusted rifles leaning against rotted stumps, and a single pair of shackles hanging empty from a cypress limb. It was as if the earth itself had opened its mouth and swallowed the 5 men whole without a trace. The master's gold remained unclaimed, and his pride was replaced by a cold, lingering fear that never truly left him. In the quarters, the story of that night was told in hushed tones behind closed doors, where the overseers couldn't hear. Elara was no longer spoken of as a runaway, but as a spirit of the woods who stood guard over the path. They whispered that she had not just escaped slavery, but had ascended into something ancient, powerful, and entirely untouchable by man. Mothers told their children that the rustle of the leaves was her footsteps, ensuring that no hunter would ever again feel safe. Her name became a prayer for those in chains and a curse for those who held the heavy, braided lash. She was the ghost in the green, the woman who had rewritten the laws of power in the Georgia mud. As decades passed and the war came to wash away the old world, the clearing in the woods remained a place of pilgrimage. Even the most hardened soldiers avoided the bog, where Silas was said to have met his final, silent reckoning. The legend grew with every telling, adding layers of mystery to the fate of the 5 men who dared to follow. Some said the trees grew taller and thicker there, fed by the blood of those who lived only to oppress. The story served as a reminder that there are depths of the human spirit that can never be truly caged. To the world, she was a missing person, but to history, she was the first spark of an inevitable fire. The legacy of the hunt that failed became a permanent stain on the Abernathy name, a shadow that haunted his bloodline. He died a broken man, convinced he could still hear the baying of ghost dogs in the dead of the night. Every time a slave went missing after that, the searchers moved with a new and palpable sense of hesitation. They looked over their shoulders, fearing the woman who had turned the swamp into a fortress of absolute justice. The wilderness had become a sanctuary, a place where the social order of the South was completely and utterly inverted. Elara's victory was not just in her survival, but in the permanent terror she planted in the hearts of the cruel. Today, the woods are silent, but those who know the tale still feel a chill when the wind shifts toward the swamp. The story of the hunted becoming the hunter remains a masterpiece of retribution, a tale of a woman who refused. She exists now in the space between history and myth, a silhouette against the moon that forever guards the way. Her secret was simple. She knew that the forest does not recognize masters, only those who are brave enough to be free. The 5 men are forgotten, their names lost to the rot, but Elara's spirit continues to walk the shadowed paths. She is the eternal hunter, a reminder that the oppressed will eventually find their way back to the light of the stars.